The heavy iron bolt slid home with a finality that echoed through the stone corridor, a sound that had been the heartbeat of Clara's existence for 7,000 days. Behind that door, the air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and the suffocating weight of 1,000 unread books. To the world beyond the ivy-choked walls of the Thorne estate, the youngest daughter was a tragedy, a sickly, frail thing who had succumbed to a wasting fever years ago. But inside this room, Clara stood before a cracked mirror, her reflection a silent scream of gold and ivory. Her beauty wasn't a gift, it was her cage. It was the reason her mother's eyes turned cold with envy and why her sister's smiles curdled like spoiled milk. They didn't hide her to protect her from the world. They hid her to protect their own fragile grip on the spotlight. But today, the air felt different. Below, the thrum of heavy carriage wheels and the authoritative bark of a driver announced an arrival that the Thorne family hadn't prepared for. A man of unshakable iron and silent observation had entered the gates, and for the first time in a decade, the lock on the door felt less like a shield and more like a countdown. Hello to all of you beautiful souls joining us today. It is so wonderful to have you back in our storytelling circle. Whether you are watching from the bustling streets of London, the quiet countryside of the Philippines, or anywhere in between, I am sending you so much love and warmth. How are you all truly doing today? I've been reading your comments, and your support means the world to me. If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and join our growing family. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a moment of these journeys we take together. Are you ready to see what happens when a secret too beautiful for the shadows finally meets the light? Clara Vane leaned her forehead against the cool mahogany of the door, her fingers tracing the jagged wood where she had tried, years ago, to claw her way out. She could hear the frantic scrubbing of servants in the hallway below and the shrill, performative laughter of her sister, Evelyn. They were hosting him, the Duke of Aristhall. He was a man whose name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror, a man who dealt in hard truths and dismantled lies for a living. Her mother, Lady Eleanor, would be preening, making sure every candle was lit and every blemish on the family's reputation was polished away. They thought they had buried Clara deep enough. They thought the rumors of the lost Vane girl had finally turned to dust. But as Clara watched from her narrow, barred window, she saw him step out of the carriage. Jack Torrance, the Duke, didn't look like a man who enjoyed tea parties or polite conversation. He looked like a wolf entering a den of foxes. He paused at the threshold, his head tilting as if catching a scent on the wind, his gaze traveling up the gray stone walls of the manor until it rested, for a fraction of a heartbeat, on the very window where Clara stood. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. If he saw her, the lie would shatter. If he saw her, her mother would move her to the cellars or worse. Yet she didn't pull away. She pressed closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She was a ghost in her own home, a masterpiece kept in a dark cellar, and for the first time in her life, she felt a desperate, reckless urge to be seen. What happens when the most powerful man in the kingdom realizes the house he's entered is built on a foundation of stolen lives? Would he be her savior? Or would he be the one to finally extinguish the light she had fought so hard to keep burning in the dark? The Duke's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing as he looked at the boarded-up wing of the house. He knew something was rotting behind the gilded facade of the Thorne estate, and Jack Torrance never left a mystery unsolved. The game was beginning, and the stakes were nothing less than Clara's soul. The Duke of Aristhall did not believe in accidents. As Jack Torrance stepped into the foyer of the Thorne estate, his boots clicking with rhythmic precision against the checkered marble, he felt the familiar prickle at the base of his neck. It was the sensation that had served him through decades of political warfare and internal investigations, the feeling of a room holding its breath. Lady Eleanor Vane approached him with a smile that was a fraction too wide, her silk gown rustling like a nest of vipers. Beside her stood her two daughters, Evelyn and Beatrice. They were handsome women, certainly, decorated in jewels that cost more than a village's harvest, but Jack saw the way their eyes darted toward the grand staircase every time a floorboard creaked above. They were performing. The entire household was a stage, and he was the audience they were desperate to please. "Your Grace," Lady Eleanor purred, dropping a curtsy that was the height of elegance. "We are honored. It is a rare thing for the king's hand to grace such a quiet corner of the world." "The world is rarely quiet, Lady Eleanor," Jack replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "Usually, silence is just a noise someone is trying to drown out." He watched the color drain slightly from Beatrice's cheeks. Jack was a man built of scars and secrets. Having lost his own family to a betrayal that still haunted his dreams, he had dedicated his life to the pursuit of the objective truth. He had no room for fluff, no patience for the vanity of the aristocracy. His deepest fear, one he never spoke aloud, was failing to see a victim right in front of him. Upstairs, Clara moved away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat at her small vanity, the only piece of furniture her mother hadn't replaced with something utilitarian. In the dim light of a single candle, her skin glowed with a luminescent quality that seemed almost otherworldly. Her hair, a cascading river of spun gold, fell to her waist. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a living reminder of her father's greatest love. Her father, the late Lord Vane, had adored her. On his deathbed, he had begged Eleanor to protect her, fearing that Clara's light would attract the wrong kind of men. But Eleanor had twisted that request. She didn't protect Clara from the world. She protected her own ego from Clara. "You are a curse, Clara," her mother would whisper during her weekly visits to the room, bringing nothing but stale bread and bitter tea. "Men would go to war for a face like yours. They would burn this house down just to possess you. I am keeping you safe. I am keeping the world safe from the chaos you would cause." Clara had spent 10 years believing her own beauty was a sin. Her only friend was Thomas, an elderly gardener who had been with the family since before she was born. He was the one who smuggled her books, the one who left fresh wildflowers on her windowsill using a long pole, and the one who whispered through the keyhole about the world outside. Thomas was the only person who knew she was still alive, other than the immediate family. "Thomas," she whispered, hearing a soft scrape at her window. A small, weathered hand pushed a note through the narrow gap in the glass. "The Duke is not like the others, little bird," the note read in shaky script. "He looks for what is hidden. Stay near the light today. If there is a God, he will hear the silence of this room." Clara felt a surge of hope so intense it was physically painful. She didn't want a duke. She wanted the sun. She wanted to walk through a field without a veil. She wanted to be more than a secret whispered in the dark. Downstairs, the Duke was being led to the dining hall, but he purposefully slowed his pace. He noticed the dust patterns on the floor. Most of the house was meticulously cleaned, but the corridor leading to the east wing was pristine, as if someone walked it frequently, yet no guests were ever invited there. He also noticed the locks. They weren't just on the outside of the house. There were internal bolts on doors that should have been open. "Your estate is quite large for only 3 women, Lady Eleanor," Jack remarked, pausing before a portrait of the late Lord Vane. "I seem to recall the census mentioning a 3rd daughter. A Clara, if I'm not mistaken." The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Eleanor's fan snapped shut with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. "A tragedy, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a rehearsed, mournful tremolo. "Poor, sweet Clara. She was taken by the fever years ago. The East Wing has been closed ever since. It is too painful to traverse those halls." Jack looked her straight in the eye. He saw the flicker of a lie, the way her pupils dilated, the way she gripped her fan until her knuckles turned white. He had seen that look on the faces of assassins and thieves. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jack said softly, though his mind was already racing. "Grief is a heavy burden. Sometimes it makes us hide things we should let go of." As they moved toward the dining room, Jack purposefully dropped his pocket watch. It skittered across the floor, sliding toward the darkened hallway of the East Wing. "Oh, how clumsy of me," he muttered. Before the footman could move, Jack stepped into the shadows to retrieve it. In that moment of hushed gloom, he looked up. High above, at the very end of the corridor, he saw a single, thin line of golden light leaking from beneath the door. And then he heard it, a faint, melodic hum. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby so full of longing it made his chest ache. It was the sound of a living soul, not a ghost. "Your Grace?" Evelyn's voice came from the foyer, sharp and panicked. "The dining room is this way." Jack straightened, his fingers closing around his watch. He tucked it into his waistcoat, his expression unreadable. He had found the thread. Now, he just had to pull it until the whole tapestry of the Thorne family's lies unraveled. "Of course," Jack said, stepping back into the light. "Lead the way. I find I've suddenly developed quite an appetite for the truth." The dinner was a masterclass in deception. Lady Eleanor spun tales of her late husband's business ventures, while Evelyn and Beatrice giggled at every word the Duke uttered, their eyes shining with a predatory ambition. But Jack Torrance wasn't listening. His mind was upstairs, in that silent, shadowed wing. He could still hear that hum, a melody of pure, unadulterated sorrow that sat in his lungs like smoke. "You seem distant, Your Grace," Lady Eleanor noted, her eyes narrowing over the rim of her crystal wine glass. "Is the venison not to your liking?" "The venison is excellent," Jack replied, his voice cool and detached. "I was merely thinking about the nature of shadows. How they can only exist if there is a light being blocked." Before Eleanor could respond, a crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by a muffled shout. In the confusion, a young maid stumbled into the dining room, her face pale. She whispered something to the butler, who immediately looked toward the east wing with an expression of sheer terror. Jack didn't wait for an explanation. This was the opening he needed. He stood abruptly, the heavy oak chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "Is something wrong?" he asked, already moving toward the door. "Nothing at all," Eleanor cried, her voice pitching an octave higher. "Just a clumsy servant, Jack. Please sit. We haven't even brought out the dessert." "I've had quite enough sugar for one evening, Eleanor," Jack said, bypassing the footman at the door. He didn't head for the exit. He turned right, toward the forbidden corridor. The air here was colder, smelling of damp stone and neglect. Behind him, he heard the frantic rustle of silk as the three women scrambled to follow him. "Your Grace, stop," Evelyn shouted, her poise finally shattering. "That wing is unstable. It's dangerous." Jack ignored her. He followed the memory of that golden light. He reached the end of the hall, where a heavy oak door stood, reinforced with a literal iron bar. It wasn't a bedroom door, it was a vault. "Open it," Jack commanded, his voice echoing like a thunderclap. "I don't have the key," Eleanor hissed, her face contorting into a mask of cold fury. "This is my home, Duke. You have no right to trespass in the chambers of my grief." "I am the king's hand," Jack said, turning to face her, his eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "And in the name of the crown, I have the right to investigate any property where a crime is suspected. And hiding a living person as a corpse is a very grave crime indeed." Inside the room, Clara heard the shouting. Her heart hammered so hard, she thought it might burst through her ribs. She moved toward the door, her hands trembling. For years, she had been a shadow. She had been told she was a danger, a curse. But the voice on the other side of the door didn't sound like a man afraid of a curse. It sounded like a man hunting for justice. With a strength born of a decade of desperation, Clara picked up a heavy porcelain wash basin and hurled it against the door. Crash! The sound solidified Jack's resolve. He didn't wait for a key. He stepped back, adjusted his weight, and slammed his shoulder into the wood. The bar groaned. He hit it again, the impact jarring his bones, but he felt nothing but the burn of adrenaline. On the third strike, the wood splintered, and the iron bar bent. The door swung inward with a violent groan. The room was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, which bled through the narrow window. And there, standing amidst the shattered porcelain, was the most breathtaking woman Jack had ever seen. Her skin was like fine silk, her eyes a deep, soulful violet that held the weight of 1,000 lonely nights. Her hair caught the dying light, glowing like a halo of fire. She wasn't the sickly, pale ghost Eleanor had described. She was a goddess in a tattered cotton shift. Jack froze. He had seen the beauties of the royal court, the painted ladies of the capital. But this was raw, unfiltered perfection. It was a beauty so intense it felt like a physical blow to the chest. "Clara," he breathed, the name a prayer on his lips. Clara stared at him. He was taller than she imagined, his shoulders broad and his face carved from granite. But his eyes, they weren't cold. They were filled with a sudden, overwhelming protectiveness. "You're real," she whispered, her voice rasping from years of disuse. "I am," Jack said, stepping across the threshold. "Get out." Lady Eleanor screamed from the hallway, her face purple with rage. "She is a monster. Look at her. She will ruin us all. She is cursed." Jack didn't turn around. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just inches from Clara's face. "You aren't a curse, Clara. You're a miracle." At that moment, the romantic tension was a living thing between them, a bridge built over a decade of isolation. But the moment was shattered when Lady Eleanor grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from the hallway and lunged toward them, her eyes wild with the realization that her kingdom of lies was falling. Jack moved with the fluidity of a soldier, stepping in front of Clara to shield her, but as he did, he saw something in the hallway behind the mother. The butler was holding a pistol, and it wasn't pointed at the Duke. It was pointed at the girl who was never supposed to exist. The air in the narrow hallway turned electric as the butler's finger tightened on the trigger. Jack didn't hesitate. He didn't have the luxury of negotiation. With a roar of focused aggression, he lunged, not away from the danger, but directly into the path of the barrel. He shoved Lady Eleanor aside, her silk gown tearing as she hit the stone floor, and tackled the butler just as the pistol discharged. Bang! The lead ball whistled past Clara's ear, shattering the mirror behind her into 1,000 diamond-like shards. Clara screamed, a sound that ripped through the stale air of the East Wing, echoing with the pain of 10 years of silence. Jack pinned the butler to the floor, his forearm pressing against the man's throat until the pistol clattered away. "Touch her again," Jack hissed, his voice a low, terrifying vibration, "and I will ensure the king's executioner is the last person you ever see." He stood up, his chest heaving, and turned to Clara. She was trembling, her hands pressed against her mouth, staring at the destruction of her prison. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room in a bruised purple twilight. "We have to go. Now," Jack said, extending his hand. "Go." Lady Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her hair coming loose from its pins, looking like a skeletal wraith. "You can't take her. She is Thorn property. She is a ward of this house." "She is a human being held in a cage," Jack countered, his eyes flashing. "And this house is no longer a home. It is a crime scene." He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed Clara's hand. Her skin was ice cold, but as his fingers closed around hers, he felt a spark, a jolt of pure, raw connection that made his heart skip. He pulled her toward the door, but as they reached the threshold, Evelyn and Beatrice stood in the way, their faces twisted not with fear, but with a desperate, ugly jealousy. "You're taking her to the capital?" Beatrice cried. "To show her off? To make us the laughingstock of the season? She'll be the talk of every ballroom while we rot here." "You've lived in her shadow even while she was locked in a room," Jack said, pushing past them with a coldness that cut like a blade. "Imagine how small you'll feel when the world finally sees her." As they descended the grand staircase, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The servants were staring, their mouths agape at the sight of the ghost of Thorn Manor, walking among them. Clara felt the weight of their stares, the awe, the confusion, and the biting envy. She felt like a newborn animal, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the world. The foyer felt like an ocean. The front door looked like the gateway to another planet. "Stay close to me," Jack whispered, his hand sliding down to grip hers more firmly. They reached his carriage, the black lacquered wood gleaming in the moonlight. Jack's driver, a man of few words named Alfred Pennyworth, didn't blink at the sight of the girl in the tattered shift. He simply opened the door. "To the Aristal estate," Jack commanded. "And drive as if the devil is chasing us. Because I suspect Lady Eleanor has more than just disgruntled servants at her disposal." As the carriage lurched forward, Clara looked back. She saw her mother standing on the portico, her face a mask of shadow. Eleanor wasn't crying. She was watching. And in her hand, she held a small, silver whistle. She blew it, a soundless vibration that made the horses neigh in distress. Inside the carriage, the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. Clara sat tucked into the corner of the velvet seat, her knees pulled to her chest. Jack sat opposite her, his gaze intense. He had shed his formal coat, leaving him in his white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "Why did you do it?" Clara asked, her voice finally steadying. "You don't know me. I could be exactly what they said. I could be dangerous." Jack reached out, but hesitated, stopping his hand mid-air before gently resting it on the seat. Beside her. "I spent my life looking for things that are real, Clara. In the king's court, everything is painted and polished until the truth is buried under layers of gold leaf. You are the first real thing I've seen in a decade." The carriage rattled as they took a sharp turn, sending Clara sliding toward him. Jack caught her, his hands steadying her shoulders. For a moment, the world stopped. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood and rain, filled her lungs. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the fear in her heart was replaced by something else. Something warm. Something terrifyingly hopeful. "They won't stop, Jack," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "My mother, she has connections. People who owe her debts. Darker people than the butler." "Let them come," Jack said, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. "I've spent my life breaking men who thought they were untouchable. I'm not about to let a family of vipers take back the only light this world has left." But as they sped toward the safety of his estate, a sudden thud echoed from the roof of the carriage. The vehicle swayed violently. From outside, a guttural shout rang out, and the sound of steel clashing against steel filled the night. Jack's eyes hardened. He reached into the hidden compartment beneath the seat and pulled out a heavy rapier. "Stay on the floor," he ordered. The mystery wasn't over. It was evolving. Lady Eleanor hadn't just kept Clara hidden. She had been protecting a secret far more dangerous than beauty, a secret that was now hunting them through the dark woods of the valley. The carriage lurched violently to the left, the sound of a snapped trace pole echoing like a bone breaking. Clara hit the floor as the vehicle skidded to a halt, the world tilting at a sickening angle. Outside, the night was alive with the screams of horses and the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps on the roof. Jack was out the door before the carriage had even stopped swaying, his rapier drawn and gleaming like a sliver of the moon. Clara scrambled to the window, her breath hitching. In the pale moonlight, she saw Jack engaged in a blur of motion against 3 masked men. They weren't common highwaymen. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace. "Jack!" she cried out as a blade whistled inches from his throat. With a grunt of exertion, Jack parried a blow and delivered a crushing kick to one man's chest, sending him flying into the underbrush. He spun, his blade a silver arc, forcing the others back. But they weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to get past him. They were after her. Inside, Clara. "Stay down," Jack roared. Suddenly, the side of the carriage was ripped open, not by a tool, but by a strength that seemed impossible. A man with a heavy iron mask reached in, his gloved hand closing around Clara's wrist. She screamed, kicking at him, but his grip was like a vice. "The blood of the sun," the masked man hissed, his voice a distorted rasp. "Return what was stolen, little ghost." Jack appeared behind the man, his eyes burning with a primal fury. He didn't use his sword. He slammed his shoulder into the giant, tackling him away from the carriage. The 2 men crashed into the dirt, a brutal struggle of shadows and steel. "Alfred, get her out of here," Jack commanded, but the driver was busy fending off 2 more attackers. Clara felt a strange heat building in her chest, a pulsing, rhythmic throb that synchronized with her fear. As the masked man pinned Jack to the ground, raising a heavy mace to crush his skull, Clara felt a dam inside her shatter. She didn't think, she reacted. She reached out her hand toward the attacker, a desperate plea for Jack's life screaming in her mind. A blinding flash of golden light erupted from her palms. It wasn't fire, and it wasn't a spark, it was a wave of pure, kinetic radiance. The force of it hit the attacker like a physical blow, throwing him 30 feet back into a massive oak tree with a sickening crack. Silence fell over the forest. The remaining attackers froze, staring at Clara, who stood in the wreckage of the carriage, her hands still glowing with a fading, ethereal shimmer. Jack scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of shock. He looked at the unconscious giant, then back at Clara. The attackers, seeing the display of power, retreated into the shadows of the woods, their mission compromised. What was that? Jack whispered, stepping toward her. He didn't look afraid. He looked completely floored, as if he had just seen a myth come to life. Clara collapsed onto the velvet seat, her hands trembling as the glow vanished. "I don't know," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "My mother," she said, "I was a curse. She said if I ever went into the sun, the world would burn because of me. I thought she meant my face, Jack. I thought she meant the way I looked." Jack climbed into the ruined carriage and took her hands in his. They were warm, unusually warm, but they felt human. He looked into her violet eyes and saw the terror of a girl who had been lied to about her very nature. "Your mother didn't hide you because you were beautiful, Clara," Jack said, the realization hitting him like a physical weight. "She hid you because you are a source. The legends of the Vane lineage, they weren't metaphors. Your ancestors were the protectors of the crown's oldest secrets. You possess the light they've been trying to synthesize for centuries." "A source?" Clara shook her head. "I'm just a girl who is locked in a room." "No," Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper of shared vulnerability. "You are the most powerful political asset in the kingdom. If the king knew, if the rival houses knew, they wouldn't just lock you away. They would use you as a weapon. Your mother wasn't protecting you. She was hoarding you. She was waiting for the right price to sell a goddess." He pulled her into his arms, and this time, the kiss wasn't just a possibility. It was an anchor. It was desperate and sweet, a promise of protection in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous than a locked room. But as they held each other in the wreckage, Clara pulled back, her eyes wide with a new horror. "Jack, if they know what I am, they'll never stop. My mother has already sent word. That silver whistle, it wasn't for the horses. It was a signal to the High Council." Jack's jaw set. The High Council was the only body with more power than the king's hand. He had thought he was rescuing a maiden from a cruel mother. Instead, he had just declared war on the very foundation of the kingdom. "Then we don't go to my estate," Jack decided, his mind already spinning a new web of strategy. "We go to the one place they won't look. The ruins of the old temple. If you're a source, we need to find out how to control it before it consumes you, or before they turn you into a battery for their wars." He looked out at the dark road ahead. The mystery had shifted from a family secret to a national conspiracy. And at the center of it was the woman he was beginning to realize he couldn't live without. The ruins of the old temple were nothing more than skeletal remains of marble and ivy, perched precariously on the edge of the weeping cliffs. Rain began to fall, a cold, needle-like drizzle that soaked through Jack's linen shirt and Clara's thin shift. They had abandoned the carriage miles back to lose their pursuers, trekking through the treacherous mountain passes on foot. Jack led the way, his hand never leaving Clara's, but his movements were heavy. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his side, a parting gift from the iron-masked giant. Every step was a battle against the encroaching darkness of the forest and the exhaustion threatening to pull them under. "We're almost there," Jack wheezed, though his face was a ghostly shade of gray. "Jack, you're hurting," Clara cried, trying to pull him toward a sheltered overhang. "Stop, please. You've done enough." "I haven't done nearly enough," he countered, his voice cracking. "I took you out of one cage only to put you in the middle of a battlefield. If the council finds us here, Clara, I can't protect you from them." Not like this. They found refuge in a small inner sanctum where the roof had miraculously remained intact. Jack collapsed against a fallen pillar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence of the ruins was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water and the distant, haunting howl of wolves, or perhaps something much worse. Clara knelt beside him, her heart shattering as she saw the extent of his injuries. The man who had seemed like an unshakable mountain of authority was now broken and vulnerable, all for the sake of a girl he barely knew. She felt a wave of profound despair. For 10 years, she had prayed for a savior, but she had never considered that her freedom would cost the life of the only person who had ever truly seen her. "You have to leave me," Jack whispered, his eyes fluttering shut. "There's a path behind the altar. It leads to the coast. Find a boat. Go where nobody knows the name Vane." "I'm not leaving you." Clara's voice rose, echoing off the damp stones. "I spent my life in a room waiting for the world to come to me. Now that I've found you, I won't let the world take you away." But the darkness wasn't just in their hearts, it was manifesting. A low, rhythmic chanting began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that felt like teeth grinding on bone. Outside, the mist thickened, glowing with a sickly, unnatural green light. Lady Eleanor appeared at the entrance of the sanctum, but she was no longer the preening aristocrat. She was flanked by 12 men in crimson robes, the High Council's inquisitors. They carried long, silver staves that hummed with a discordant energy, designed to suppress and siphon power from a source. "Clara, darling," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a terrifying, foam-eternal sweetness. "Look at what you've done. You've killed a duke. You've broken the king's laws. You're a monster, just as I told you." "I'm not a monster," Clara said, standing up and shielding Jack's unconscious body with her own. "I am your daughter. You are an asset," Eleanor screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure greed. "You are the battery that will power this kingdom for the next 100 years. Your sisters will marry kings because of the energy you provide. Do you think I kept you in that room for fun? I kept you pure. I kept you contained. And now, the council will finish what I started." The inquisitors raised their staves. A pulse of emerald energy shot out, hitting the ground at Clara's feet. She felt the power within her recoil, shrinking back into the depths of her soul. It felt like being burned from the inside out. She fell to her knees, her vision blurring. "No," she whimpered, reaching back to touch Jack's hand one last time. The council members stepped forward, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the floor. They were closing in, their silver chains rattling. This was it. The hope that had ignited in the carriage was being extinguished in the mud of a ruined temple. Jack was dying. Clara was being reclaimed by the void, and the truth of her existence was about to be turned into a weapon of mass destruction. "Take her," Eleanor commanded, a triumphant sneer on her lips. "And kill the Duke. We can't have witnesses to the resurrection of the Source." As the lead inquisitor reached out a gloved hand to seize Clara's throat, the world seemed to slow to a crawl. Clara looked at Jack, at the man who had risked everything for a shadow, and felt a cold, hard resolve crystallize in her chest. If she was a curse, then she would be the greatest curse they had ever encountered. The darkness of the temple's lower catacombs was absolute, a heavy shroud that felt like the weight of the earth itself. Jack lay pinned under the dampening net, his limbs feeling like leaden weights. The Iron Guard had left him for dead, believing the paralyzing salts would keep him stationary until the cleanup crew arrived to finish the job. But Silas Vane had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the sheer, transformative power of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. In the silence, Jack didn't reach for his sword. He reached for his memory. He closed his eyes and summoned the image of Clara, not as a source, not as a political asset, but as the girl who had looked at him with wonder in a room full of dust and shadows. He remembered the warmth of her hand and the way she had sacrificed her own safety to save him in the woods. "I am not done," Jack hissed through gritted teeth. With a roar that tore through his throat, He ignored the screaming agony in his nerves and forced his hand to move. He gripped a jagged shard of the porcelain wash basin Clara had thrown earlier, a piece that had hitched a ride in his boot during the escape. He sawed at the weighted netting, the leading fused ropes slicing into his palms, until finally, the tension snapped. He tumbled out, gasping, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the paralysis. He was weak, he was bleeding, and he was alone. "Looking for this, Your Grace?" Jack spun, his hand flying to his empty belt. Emerging from the shadows was Thomas, the elderly gardener from the Thorne estate. In his weathered hands, he carried Jack's rapier and a small, glowing vial of amber liquid. "Thomas?" Jack exhaled, leaning against a pillar. "I followed the carriage in the old supply cart," Thomas whispered, his eyes bright with a fierce, quiet courage. "I've watched that girl with her for 10 years, sir. I wasn't about to watch her disappear into the citadel. This vial, it's an infusion of sun lily and mountain spring. It won't give you her power, but it will burn the dampening salts out of your blood." Jack didn't hesitate. He downed the bitter liquid. Instantly, a searing heat raced through his veins, clearing the fog in his mind and returning the strength to his grip. He took his sword, the weight of the steel feeling like an extension of his own resolve. "They took her to the northern gate," Thomas warned. "The council plans to move her under the cover of the morning mist. Once she's inside the citadel's lead-line vaults, Jack, not even the king will be able to touch her. Then I'll stop them at the gate," Jack said, his voice regaining its terrifying, authoritative edge. "But I can't do it alone. Thomas, I need you to find Alfred. Tell him to gather the men who still remember what it means to serve the people, not the council." Meanwhile, miles away in a moving ironclad transport, Clara sat in the corner of her cage. The lead collar felt like a mountain on her neck, suppressing her very breath. But in the void of her power, something else was growing, her will. She realized that for 10 years, she had been a victim of her own beauty and her family's fear. But the Duke had looked at her and seen a choice. She looked at the lock of the cage. She didn't need the light of the sun to be clever. She reached into her hair, pulling out a thin silver pin Jack had given her to hold her tattered shift together. "I am not a curse," she thought, her eyes hardening with a fire that no lead collar could extinguish. "And I am done being hidden." She began to work the pin into the lock, her movements silent and precise. Outside, the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The turning point had arrived. The Duke was coming, not as a savior for a damsel, but as a partner for a queen who was finally ready to claim her own crown. "Wait for me, Jack," she whispered into the cold iron. "Because when we meet again, I'm going to burn the world they built for us." The aftermath of the battle at the northern gate did not bring the chaos the council had feared, but rather a profound, shimmering peace. As the sun rose naturally over the horizon, its rays mingled with the fading glow of Clara's own light, signaling a new dawn for the kingdom. The High Council, stripped of their secret weapon and exposed by the Duke's meticulous collection of Lady Eleanor's correspondence, was dismantled within weeks. The king, moved by the bravery of his most trusted hand and the resilience of the woman they had sought to exploit, issued a royal decree. Clara Vane was no longer a ward, an asset, or a ghost. She was a sovereign peer, the first of her kind. A month later, the Thorne estate stood empty, its windows no longer boarded, its gates swung wide to the wind. Lady Eleanor and her daughters had been exiled to a remote northern province, stripped of the titles they had used as bludgeons. But the East Wing, the place of Clara's long winter, was being converted into a school for the gifted, a place where secrets were shared rather than buried. On a balcony overlooking the Arist Hall Gardens, Clara stood dressed in silk the color of a summer sky. She was no longer hiding. Her beauty, once a curse used to justify her imprisonment, was now just a part of the woman who walked with her head held high. She watched as Thomas, now the head gardener of the entire duchy, tended to a bed of sunlilies that seemed to bloom more vibrantly whenever she passed by. Jack stepped out onto the balcony, his presence a warm weight at her side. He no longer wore the heavy armor of the king's hand. Today, he wore the simple, elegant coat of a man at home. He leaned against the railing, looking not at the horizon, but at her. "The capital is still talking about you," Jack said, a trace of his characteristic wit dancing in his eyes. "They say the stars look a bit dimmer now that you're walking the streets." Clara laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that reached every corner of the garden. "Let them talk. For the first time in my life, I don't care who is watching. I'm too busy seeing the world for myself." She turned to him, her expression softening. "You saved me from that room, Jack. But more than that, you saved me from believing I belonged there." Jack took her hands in his grip steady and sure. "You saved yourself, Clara. I just provided the spark. I spent my life hunting truths, but I never realized that the greatest truth was standing right in front of me, waiting for someone to be brave enough to see her." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, but before he could speak, Clara placed a finger over his lips. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out a small, smoothed piece of the stone from her old prison cell, a reminder of where she had come from. "I don't need a ring to know I'm bound to you, Jack Torrance," she whispered. "But I would very much like to see what the rest of our story looks like. Without locks. Without shadows." Jack smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his rugged face. He slid the ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold with a single, radiant diamond that caught the light. "The rest of our story, Clara, is going to be very, very bright." As they stood together, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, the people of the estate looked up and saw two figures silhouetted against the light. They saw a duke who had found his heart and a woman who had found her power. The lost vain girl was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had turned her cage into a kingdom. The mystery was over. The romance had been earned. And for Clara and Jack, the adventure was only just beginning. Thank you all so much for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. Seeing Clara finally claim her light and find a love that sees her for who she truly is, it's just so powerful, isn't it? If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, please don't forget to leave a comment below telling me your favorite part. Was it the escape or the final revelation? And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our family. We have so many more stories to tell, and I wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Until next time, keep looking for the light in the darkness. Sending you all so much love.